Good to see you all. And as you've just seen, we are recording this session so that we can share it with others who aren't able to attend live. Okay, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we will kick off. Okay, there's a couple more people joining, but I'm going to get started because we've got an hour and we've got an excellent panel of 5 speakers, and we want to make sure we've got enough time to hear from them all and for you to also be asking questions as well as we go. So welcome again to the session, which we've titled, How Did We Get Here in the First Place and What is Needed to Create Structural Change? I'm Helen Matthew. I'm one of the directors of collaboration here at London Funders, and I'm going to be your chair for today's session. So just before I introduce our panel, just a quick word about the context for today. As many of you know, and I think hopefully some of you have been joining other sessions in the last couple of days, it comes as part of our Cost of Living Week, where we've been sharing intelligence, ideas, and insights about how we can collectively support London's communities and civil society as living costs and the cost of delivering work for particularly frontline organisations are reaching record levels. So during the week, we've been bringing together voices from charities, community groups, campaigners, from funders, local authorities, to identify what it is that we need to do to tackle the scale of the crisis, both immediately and in the longer term. And it's that kind of final point there about the longer term, which we'll be kind of bringing into today's session. We're shifting away slightly from the kind of crisis mode that I think we're all in at the moment to thinking about how to tackle the underlying structural issues which have contributed to the situation that we're in today. So I'm delighted to be joined by such a brilliant panel of experts from across different sectors to explore this with us. I will introduce you now in no particular order, and then I'll do a very quick bit of housekeeping and we will move in to the meat of the session. So Sophia Moreau, a multi-award winning campaigner. She works part-time as Head of Advocacy and Communications at Little Village, an anti-child poverty charity. And Sophia uses her background in journalism, research and community engagement to build public will and tackle inequalities. So thanks, Sophia. It's great to have you with us. Mandir Kataria from the Runnymede Trust, who's Senior Policy Manager and at the UK's leading race equality think tank. They've published research on racism and the climate crisis, women of colour in the workplace, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minorities, and much more. So thanks again, Mandir, for joining us. Great to have you. Matt Drumfield, who's Managing Director of Debt Free London, a partnership of charities led by Toynbee Hall and funded by the Money and Pension Service that provides free expert advice to Londoners with problem debt. Rick Henderson, who's Chief Exec of Homeless Link, which represents charities working across England to end homelessness. And Ruth Koch from the Trussell Trust, who's the network lead for London. They support a nationwide network of food banks to provide emergency food and support to people locked in poverty and to campaign for change to end the need for food banks in the UK. So all bringing highly relevant areas of expertise and perspectives to this discussion. And so, yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Very briefly, just for the benefit of everybody who's joined us, we will be running a kind of Q&A between ourselves, but towards the end of the session, please do post any questions you've got or reflections in the Q&A bar. Hopefully you're all familiar with the Zoom stuff by now, but yeah, please do make use of that through the session. Pop your questions up there so that we can come to that towards the end of the session. So to move straight in, we've asked each of our panelists to share some opening remarks to set the scene from their perspective. So I'm going to ask you, you've kind of had about a 3-minute limit, which seems very difficult given the topic that we're grappling with. But if you could try and stick to that as best you can, and if you go wildly over, I will start waving madly from my screen. Okay, so I don't know if we have anyone who wants to kick off, but otherwise I shall just pick on someone in no particular order, in the order of my screen. Let's do that. And Ruth, you're first. So do you want to kick off? We can't hear you, Ruth. Bear with. Okay, see if it works. If not, we'll come back to you and hope it works. Okay, we're coming back to Ruth. Sophia, do you want to go? Hopefully your sound is working.
It looks like my sound is working. Thank you. So just to start off, speaking from my perspective as a community campaigner and diversity and inclusion specialist, I've seen the rising need from a few different angles. But overall, being poor is expensive. It's always been expensive. There are fewer favourable deals. You're already more likely to be on a prepaid meter and pay more for energy bills overall. And the debt that you do incur is more likely to be on unfavourable interest rates. And this reflects the lack of diverse rates in the architecture of these decisions. And this extends also to the support provided to offset the cost of living. Many of the buffers that have been provided by the government are so minor that they will primarily benefit those who are either furthest from poverty or in their first experience of financial instability, who absolutely should be accessing support. However, this is rarely even a drop in the ocean for those who are furthest from power, who are facing the most extreme poverty. And for those who were already experiencing poverty, directing people to existing benefits that they probably already applied for won't achieve much unless it's accompanied by accessible specialist advice, preferably in community settings. One of the key challenges of the cost of living crisis is that it's never just one element. Much of my work is with advice services, and they are already helping people with three primary forms of debt: council tax, rent arrears, and energy. And in an already untenable situation, energy bills are multiplying, rent is rising, and council tax support is dwindling, particularly in London boroughs. Many people found themselves ineligible for council tax support when they were previously accessing support. And as the energy bills are rising and the support that you're able to access is dwindling, people are finding themselves in more and more debt. And particularly for people who perhaps may have children, or they may perhaps have disabilities, being accosted at home by bailiffs is particularly humiliating alongside your neighbours who may be watching at the same time. And poverty is unfortunately often accompanied by humiliation. And there's a culture surrounding this that penalises those who are most impacted. And you cannot separate a cost of living crisis from a mental health crisis. Money is one of the leading contributors to deteriorating mental health. And yes, there are various factors, including heredity, chemical imbalances, but of situational stresses, there is perhaps no greater one than poverty itself. And poverty does usually accompany other forms of inequality. And even in the pandemic, and I would say we are in the shadow, but it hasn't truly finished. Redundancies were rarely equality impact assessed, and job losses more generally were likely to affect women, unlike the previous recession that we had in the late 2000s. And we can expect that to occur as redundancies continue, as businesses will unfortunately close with the cost of living crisis. Even on a local level, we'll see that perhaps some organisations, including charities, may not have returned to in-office working due to the cost of buildings and such. And while it's absolutely important that people are able to access flexible working, this will also mean that their staff members are at home faced with those rising bills. And people who are disabled are more likely to be working from home if they are able to access the workforce, meaning disabled people are facing the brunt of the rising cost of living and particularly rising energy bills. And essentially, to tackle the inequalities that this crisis has escalated, we need to take a bigger picture approach and ensure that we aren't addressing one element of the problem while another continues to grow. Advice services need a huge injection of funding to account for the rise in need, particularly for the most underserved and disenfranchised communities. Energy bills, as we already know, need urgent intervention, but benefits need to be increased so that people who are on the lowest incomes are able to access funding in a way that actually offsets the cost that they are being faced with. It was already due for an increase, but it's never more urgent than now. And there is scope within local services to support residents holistically and work in tandem with services in community settings, particularly for minority groups and minoritized groups to access help within this crisis. I hope I stayed within 3 minutes.
You were excellent, Sophia. You've set a good, the bar high for timekeeping. And yeah, thank you very much for all of those insights and some kind of clear calls for action, I think, for us all, and not least kind of that that thing of looking at the bigger picture and all the different elements that are contributing. I think there's a kind of clear need, as you've outlined, to look at all of this together. You mentioned debt quite a lot and access to debt as part of what you were just saying. So I'm going to use that as a segue to Matt. Yeah, do you want to pick up, Matt, and share some thoughts?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so my name's Matt. It's been my privilege to lead Debt Free London for the last 4 years. Debt Free London is a free advice service, as we said, funded by the Money and Pension Service, but delivered as a partnership of 16 grassroots community organisations. So it's led by Toynbee Hall, a charity that's been fighting the causes of poverty since 1884, but delivered by local Citizens Advice Network, legal centres, Fair Money Advice, Nucleus Legal Advice Centre over in West London, and a number of other smaller independent charities as well. Since it was formed 16 years ago, we've helped just over 300,000 people manage their money, and we're funded particularly for face-to-face advice as opposed to National Debt Line or Step Change or other organisations that are there and funded to help people that can manage and accept advice over telephone. So as much as it's a cliche, many of our customers come to us with that carrier bag full of unopened letters that they're either too afraid to open, or once they do open, they don't understand what it means. And they come to us at that point of emergency, where, as Sophia kind of mentioned, people are knocking at the door either to remove some of their possessions or ask them to leave their home. So it really is kind of that point of emergency. Looking at our data for this year, 56% of our customers identify as female, 24%, so just under a quarter of customers that we see are considered unfit for work for a reason. So it's not as if they can just do more hours to increase their income. On debt types, we've seen the number of customers coming to us with a utility debt, either water, gas, or electricity, double in the last 2 years. And so far, this is interesting for us. So far this financial year, we haven't yet seen the impact of the energy price increases reflected in our data. Now, this could be for several reasons. Notably, most of our customers live in housing associations or council housing, meaning they're more likely to be on those prepayment meters, again, that Sophia mentioned. Now, this effectively masks a lot of the impact that this type of debt is having, as they can turn off or self-disconnect their energy, so they're not in those arrears. However, what is interesting is that for the utility that customers cannot self-disconnect, so your water, that is now one of the most frequent debts that we've seen, on par with credit card debts, 33%. That's a significant increase year on year. So there's definitely something around those social tariffs or people choosing to self-disconnect over winter that we're really, really concerned about. And the other thing that's concerning for our data is around the number of debts people are coming to us with. So historically, customers usually come to us with about 1.92 debts on average that we can help negotiate directly with the creditors on. Over the last year, that has doubled to 3.9. So not only are customers having struggles meeting debts, it's more creditors that they're having to negotiate with. And then we look at the reasons for debt and the reasons people are struggling. And the main two reasons are low income at 65%, and people not being able to get up that career ladder, and there's those inequalities in there that means they're disadvantaged, and long-term illness. 10% of our customers identify that. So that means that the customers that turn into us are particularly vulnerable to this cost of living crisis. Even if they're not homeowners, their rents are going to be impacted when the landlords increase that as well. And all of this has meant the number of inquiries coming into our service has increased by 300% compared to this time last year. So we have responded as best that we can. During the second lockdown, we doubled the number of advisors. We trained 70 new advisors to our service to really prepare that. During the lockdown, the second lockdown, and then during the early part of this cost of living crisis in February, we went to a 24-hour service to help those people that are working families that cannot access a 9-to-5 service. And just this week, we've announced that our new permanent opening hours are 8 till 8, 7 days a week. There's a big increase. 35% of those customers are now coming to us outside of that traditional 10 till 5 period. So there's a big need for our service to be able to flex to meet modern day kind of needs of those working families. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks very much, Matt. And obviously 300% increase you were just mentioning. So I think that illustrates, very clearly the scale of the crisis that many people are finding themselves in. Mandy, can we come to you next? I shall hand it to you.
Can you hear me okay? All good. Okay, so it's clear from the opening remarks of Sophia and Matt that the rising cost of living in the UK is not a crisis that's being evenly felt across society. We recognise that low-income households are disproportionately exposed to the rising cost of basic essentials. So what we've been looking at the Runnymede Trust is the changing profile and depth of poverty. So what we found is that in a new research briefing that comes out later this week, it shows that Black and minority ethnic people across all areas of the UK are much more likely not only to be in relative poverty, but also to be in deep poverty, which is, if for those who don't know, it's a state in which the individual's household income falls below 50% of the poverty line. So meaning that they're placed at a particular risk during this crisis. So in terms of numbers on that, so despite making up 15% of the population, more than a quarter of those in deep poverty are from a Black and minority ethnic background, according to our latest data, which we'll share with you later this week when it comes out. So in practical terms, what have we been seeing in terms of the financial might and the resilience of these groups? So if I just touch on a few areas that sort of illuminate what this all means in practical terms. So debt, so people like us, obviously Matt just made a really clear case for that. So in terms of ethnic minority groups, people like us earlier this year in June found that over a third of ethnic minority professionals will rack up extra debt by taking out loans or spending on credit cards. In terms of pay, we found the same research finds that working professionals from these backgrounds are nearly twice as likely to have been told they won't be getting a promised pay rise this year due to inflation compared to their white counterparts. In terms of savings, this is quite a powerful fact, or one that's quite hard hitting. So Labour analysis earlier this year in February showed that 78% of adults from Black households reported having under £1,500 worth of savings and investment, and over 500,000 reported, and that's 24%, reported zero savings. So quite hard hitting and shocking around the state of financial resilience of these communities. And one last one to stress that point is around sick pay. So the think tank IPPR earlier this year found that a racial disparity in access to sick pay. So South Asian workers were found to be 40% more likely to lack access to sick pay than their white British worker counterpart. So while much of this financial instability in recent months, even years, has been sparked by external events, the pandemic, the Ukraine war, we need to understand the longer term trends and patterns that have meant that such a profound number of households across the UK have struggled through this crisis and lacked the financial resilience to withstand these external economic shocks, because that hasn't just happened overnight. There have been longer term, decades worth of factors and policies and various things that have led to this extreme lack of resilience amongst communities that we mostly look at, which is Black and minority ethnics, but also with others. So the intersection of gender, disability, class. So if the COVID-19 pandemic taught us anything, it's that these different groups fare differently in times of crisis. So we need to look at these crises through an intersectional lens and understand how different groups are being uniquely impacted. So as I said, be it class, gender, race, or disability. I'll leave that there, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Mandy. And yeah, I hope we can come back to some of those points that you've raised, as well as Matt and Sophia in the questions shortly. Rick, can I come to you next? Obviously, there's been quite a lot in the press about the cost of living crisis in terms of creating new homelessness, but obviously this is a problem that's been around for a long time. So can you share from your perspectives what we need to do?
Sure. I mean, clearly homelessness is a kind of extreme manifestation of poverty and social inequality, and very visible, a sign of it, particularly in the rough sleeping space. And one of the important things to say here for people that might not know too much about this is that the system is currently set up in such a way that it you often have to be seen to be sleeping on the streets before you can start to access the help that you need to get back off the streets. And this is a desperately kind of inefficient system. It's also inhumane, but that is the current system. I mean, the government currently does have a strategy to end rough sleeping, but it is focused on those people that are already sleeping rough, and not really in the right direction, which is much further upstream. What we want to try and do is prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. And the cost of living crisis is going to be a huge obstacle to homelessness prevention work. Poor people tend to not own their own houses. They tend to rent. In London, rents are ridiculous as a proportion of income, whether that be for working people or people on benefits. So that then if energy bills, food bills, petrol bills, everything else goes up, it's going to be more and more difficult for people to pay their rents. That puts people at risk of eviction, at risk of homelessness. And so we fear a huge spike in homelessness over the next couple of years, unless something is done to kind of alleviate that. And we don't see any evidence that that's being taken seriously enough by the government. They're looking at the rough sleeping issue and not looking at the homelessness prevention issue. And that's because, in a way, the rough sleeping issue is easier to resolve because you're working with a few thousand individuals that are known and can be supported on a kind of individual basis. But the structural causes of homelessness, poverty, inequality, welfare policy, the hostile environment in relation to immigration, the affordable housing crisis, siloed working between government departments and at a local level, those kind of structural causes of homelessness are not being addressed because the government finds them too difficult. They're too fundamentally challenging for a government that would rather use a sticking plaster approach. So for those of us working in this space, whether that be homelessness organisations, advice organisations, or anyone else working in that space, I fear for the next couple of years. And I do think that perhaps what we're going to need to be doing, and we maybe this is for a later conversation, is that we probably need to be dividing our efforts fairly equally between campaigning and practical assistance, because I think one won't work without the other, not least because it's the practical assistance that gives us the evidence to support our campaigning, as previous speakers have described. So that's probably enough for me as an opening gambit.
Thank you, Rick. And again, let's come back to that question of campaigning and advocacy a little bit later on. I'll come though to Ruth now, and hopefully your sound is working. Fingers crossed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So over to you, Ruth.
Great. Thank you. So let me set the scene a little bit. The other day, I was helping at a food bank warehouse. It's a shop front on the main street in the borough, and a lady and her young family stopped by. We weren't at that time distributing food, we were just sorting parcels and getting things ready. She'd already visited the food bank centre earlier that week, but still needed help and support. She explained that with the rising cost of food and fuel, the money that she had just didn't stretch to feed her children and to help her make ends meet. English was not her first language, and she needed support of what to do next. She'd already had a conversation with the local authority on the phone, got a little bit lost and found herself at the food bank. We were able to ensure she was in the right place at the right time to get extra support, and also that she had access to food. But this example sets the scene of what Trussell Trust food banks are facing across London at the moment. The majority of people who come to food banks do that because they don't have enough money. In 2020, 95% of referrals to us, people who were referred to us, were destitute, which means they're unable to afford to eat or stay warm. And nearly 4 in 5 people referred to food banks in the network reported they had a physical disability, a long-term physical condition or illness, a mental health condition, or a learning disability or learning difficulty. So that's nearly 4 in 5 of the people who are referred to Trussell Trust food banks. And then 18% of the households referred to food banks over the COVID-19 pandemic were from single parent families. That's twice the rate in the general working age population. So although the experience of being referred to a food bank isn't universal and it's different for everybody, we've found there's a number of drivers of food bank use, and the most significant of that is not having enough income from the social security system. And then it's followed by challenging life events, such as an eviction, or having exhausted or having lack of local social support. On average, those people who are referred to our food banks are managing on £50 or less a week after their housing costs. And when they come to the food bank, it's often the first form of support that they've been able to access. So at Trussell Trust, we're working to ensure that food banks, rather than being the first port of call, are the last port of call, so that people can access the support and the advice they need to look at the situation that they're facing and understand why they can't afford the essentials. We understand that a food parcel can address immediate hunger, but it's an inadequate response and cannot address the underlying financial crisis that people are facing. And we're seeing increased numbers across the network of people being referred to food banks, especially in London, with people coming in who are asking for food that doesn't involve cooking because they don't want to spend fuel costs and money on fuel. So we're giving out kettle packs where you've got not great, huge amounts of food in comparison to your normal 3-day-a-week emergency food parcel from a food bank. And we anticipate that people who are going to be referred to food banks will have to come more often over the coming months. And more people are going to be referred to food banks for the first time. And that's because they find themselves in that situation where they're facing a financial crisis. And again, a food parcel isn't an adequate response to that. So we want to look at putting food banks at the last port of call, the last bit of call, so they get everything they need beforehand to help them resolve that.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thank you all again for your opening remarks. We've got a couple of questions that I'll put to you now, but just to remind our audience to please put any questions that you might have, picking up any points that any of our speakers have raised in the Q&A panel, so that we can come to those in a moment. But just to sort of get the ball rolling, you've all talked about the immediate short-term crisis, that the people you're working with and the communities, in your networks are facing. So there's obviously, as we've talked about previously in our cost of living week, talked about what those immediate needs are. But also you've all referenced the longer term changes. There's talk of, low pay, the benefits levels, the housing crisis in London in particular. Given the scale of those challenges, what are some of the longer term changes that you think, we really have to prioritise and focus on at the moment? I appreciate a lot of that is government, and that may still be, things that we need to kind of focus on, but particularly, for funders and the members in our kind of networks. What are some of those long-term changes that you think need to be at the top of our minds as we kind of head through this crisis? I shall leave it open to see if anybody wants to jump in.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
Just thinking, so obviously you have mentioned this, as an organisation, we have some recommendations for the UK government, such as increasing the cost of living support that's already committed, where, it's great that there is support that's been put in place, but that needs further payments. And we need to uprate social security benefits in line with inflation, make debt deduction rates from benefits more affordable, and particularly, which is local and thinking about the support that's offered across London, is a new settlement of integrated local crisis support. So the household support fund needs to be, at the moment it's been awarded every 6 months. We need a more long-term approach for that. And locally, how can we look at that support that's in place in different boroughs across London and integrate it across the city, so that people aren't in a postcode lottery, where if they live in Barking, they get one level of support, and if they live in Merton, they get another level. And so ensuring that people understand the access that they have to that support, which leads to looking at local advice services. And that's already been mentioned, that there is some good advice and support available, but it's expected to be stretched. So supporting more of that local advice services in community settings so it's accessible for people. We find that people at food banks struggle to access support because they may not have credit on their phones, or, as already been mentioned, people are not back in the offices, so they're not there in person. So how do we integrate that advice and financial inclusion work to help people to maximise their income in a community setting where people get that access? So some support around that locally, and integrating that with the local welfare assistance that's in place could help long term to help people to maximise their income and therefore not find themselves in a place where they can't afford the essentials.
Thank you, Ruth. Some very clear recommendations on that, which was really helpful. So thank you. Mandia, did you want to come in?
I'm happy to jump in now. Yeah, totally agree with all of what you've said, Ruth, around education and strengthening the social security system. I think I saw a stat that from Policy and Practice that about, I think, over 15 billion in benefits goes unclaimed each year. I think that was from earlier this year. So there's a lot around educating people to know what support is available, how to claim it. And especially when it comes to minority ethnic communities, there's sort of barriers to access across a lot of the public services in terms of language and general trust in these services. So that's a long-term thing that needs to be tackled. And yeah, in terms of the social security system, we need to, I think the overwhelming consensus from much of the civil society organisations I've listened to who've been very vocal with what's going on recently, it seems like targeting that social security system is really important. And so we need to target, the greatest help to those households most in need. Whereas the policy making at the moment seems to be targeting those that are probably less in need. But yeah, we could sit here all day and talk about the recent fiscal measures, but I won't get into that. So the one big thing that, in terms of long-term change, that I've seen in our work is the real need to tackle income inequality in the employment space, because Black and minority ethnic people are very much overrepresented in low-paying and insecure employment, and that's a major factor in their poverty profile. So things that the government could do is reviewing its approach to minimum and living wage, and ensuring that all these workers are paid a living wage that takes into account the rising cost of living. And beyond that, we need stronger employment protection for those on insecure contracts, because the gig economy is only growing and embedding in our way of societal functioning. And so the government should look into, stronger employment protections, as well as perhaps some kind of ethnicity pay gap reporting consultation in the same vein as the gender pay gap reporting. Maybe that could drive higher wages, higher living standards, and tackle that sort of the poverty the nature of it that we're seeing, i.e. beneath the deep poverty line, where it's expanding and widening and things are getting worse for certain social groups. That's, I think those were my sort of key recommendations.
Thank you, Mandia. Rick, yes.
I mean, a couple of things specifically in the homelessness space that happened during the pandemic that have stopped now, that seem to work and make a difference. There was an evictions ban during the period of the pandemic, which has been lifted now, and there are some calls for that to be brought back in response to the cost of living crisis, just to keep people in their accommodation during this kind of real emergency period, particularly with the winter coming up, which is always a big concern for people in my sector. So evictions ban would be great. I think the other thing was an increase in the local housing allowance rates, which made it slightly more affordable for people in rented accommodation. We wrote to the government, Homeless Link Crisis Shelter, and a bunch of other organisations wrote to the Chancellor the week before last to ask for that to be reinstated. In Scotland, they've introduced a rent freeze, or they are in the process of introducing a rent freeze to make sure that rents don't increase during this difficult time, so that people stand a better chance of being able to pay their rent and their bills, and therefore staying there in their accommodation. So I think there are some things like that can be done, but some of the more fundamental issues, it seems to me, I mean, the welfare system is the best way to distribute funds to people in poverty, I think, that we have. But in order to fund that, we have to look at taxation as a way of raising income to pay for that. And of course, we can see that playing itself out right now, that kind of battle, if you like, between rich and poor. And of course, most people in government are rich, so the decisions they make are you know, they have an incentive. They incentivize the rich, not the poor. Unfortunately, that might be a bit too political, but this seems to be true.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to ask Matt, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, and I don't want to add on to what colleagues have already said brilliantly around kind of government policy positions and what needs to happen there. Just kind of a look ahead to what we anticipate coming. So pre-pandemic, we knew in London there was 1.4 million Londoners that were over indebted and had a problem dealt with creditors chasing them. Money and Pension Service has done some research post-pandemic now, and they know that that's now increased. So there's now 27% of Londoners are now in crisis and needing debt advice. And a further 24% of Londoners are in a pre-crisis stage and they will need debt advice in the future. So our capacity as a sector to help those that are either in emergency need now or about to be in need is nowhere near the capacity that we're going to have to do it. The other thing that we know is that when the client access our advice services, they're likely engaging in a number of other services too. And as Ruth said earlier, you know, we want people accessing the food bank as the last result. We want to stop that well before they get there. So there's a question, I think, for our sector in terms of coordination. We don't want people, you know, it's really emotional when they come to us. Often people are in tears. They talk about not wanting to be here anymore. We don't want them to have to kind of relive that every time we say, well, we can help you with your debt advice, but actually if you want housing advice or benefits advice, we're going to have to signpost you over here. It's a bit of a mess, right? That's not the service people expect for when they shop at the high street or they deal with online retailers. It's a seamless connected service. The other thing to think about as a sector is the accessibility of our services. As I said, Debt Free London has been going for kind of 17 years and had always been 10 till 5 weekdays. This pandemic and the cost of living crisis is affecting people that have never been affected before, as well as those that traditionally have been always affected. So we're going to have to adapt our services to make sure our services are accessible at a time and place that suits them. If our services are only available weekdays, what we're essentially saying to somebody that's juggling multiple jobs, has childcare responsibilities, maybe a carer for another family member, is we're saying, put your life on hold, right? Come to our outreach centre or our advice centre or our service. And if it's not too busy, which it's likely to be because our services are so in demand, we might be able to help you. And you know, I kind of challenge the sector for us to all work together more closely to try and coordinate that. So somebody only has to ever tell their story once. We share our systems on the back end and connect up. It's going to be more efficient for the sector, for our services to run, and it will be a better customer experience only having to tell their story once and really creating that holistic wraparound service. And I'd really be open to anybody watching or any panelists or anybody else to kind of reach out and try and turn that into a more connected third sector response.
Thanks, Matt. And that leads very nicely. We've got a question that's Victoria, who's listening, has raised. And actually, Sophia, it was in response to a point you've made, but actually, Matt, you've started to touch on this just now about that access, you know, access to benefits and advice, but needing that in a kind of specialist or you know, there's the role of specialist advice, but actually the importance of community settings as well. And yeah, Victoria just asked if you could expand on that a bit, probably building on what Matt's just said.
Absolutely. So there is the importance of increased local service funding and joint up working, but particularly in terms of community settings and making sure that it's inclusive and meeting people where they are. They aren't hard to reach. We aren't working hard enough in order to meet them where they actually are. Many local services are funded by the council, so when they face tough times, or in my local council's case, go bankrupt, the services that would have reached people in the community are often the first to be cut. So for example, sometimes you'll get a locally funded advice service that's able to go into a care leavers housing centre and deliver the sessions there, to go into a carer support centre for people who perhaps have disabled children or dependents and be able to provide advice sessions there. Those services are sometimes the first to go. So that's why the injection of funding, particularly at a local level, is so important. But also to ensure that it is culturally competent, going into, for example, religious centres or trusted community organisations, using that liaison, perhaps even funding them in order to have their own advice function within those organisations, because they already have the trust and the access to the community. And also meeting people where they are in terms of perhaps their caring responsibilities, children's playgroups, GP services, looking at the times of day that these services are provided in. And I think that was already touched on by Matt as well. And also that extends to, in terms of reducing mental health waiting lists and the secondary effects of poverty and the cost of living crisis. The availability of culturally competent mental health is particularly important, as racism is one of the leading contributions to deteriorating mental health, as are other forms of exclusion in society. I have seen some examples of culturally competent mental health. For example, in East London Mental Health Trust, I understand that there are culturally competent group and individual therapies, but they're not nearly as common as they should be, and that model needs to be rolled out.
Thanks, Sophia. And you've excellently moved us to a second question, which has come through the panel. So expertly done, which is around actually mental health, and is something that you referenced, and a couple of others have also referenced, you know, the mental health going alongside, you know, many of the other issues that people are experiencing. And the questions from Sarah at United Saviours, that in Southwark, you know, they're seeing worrying levels of anxiety and stress amongst users of their charity partners, and just wondered if any of the panel want to talk a bit more about the current thinking in terms of access to mental health services. And I guess a follow on from me in particular, if there are things that you know could suggest in terms of the wider funding community. Obviously there's some that's statutory responsibility, but are there other takeaways that funders might want to think about in terms of mental health? Does anybody want to have a go at that one? Sophia.
Just a very quick point, but statutory services absolutely love directing people to the voluntary sector. I've seen flyers where almost all of the organisations that people are directed to in a crisis are voluntary-led organisations. It's not ideal, but it's where we are. So absolutely funding voluntary organisations so that they're able to provide services, and that will meet the short-term needs that people are facing at this time, while we win that bigger battle of getting longer-term sustainable services that are provided centrally.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some examples in my sector of, in fact, we've funded some of them through our grants programs of homelessness charities employing their own mental health support workers, really out of frustration at the fact that they can't refer their clients through to statutory mental health. And I think that's at first I wasn't sure about it. At first my attitude was, you know, we're letting the system off the hook. But actually, I've been persuaded, I think, by going and seeing some of this stuff, that the need is so kind of desperate and urgent and acute that actually doing something like that is probably the right thing to do, so long as we don't take our foot off the kind of campaigning pedal. And I think this duality is a real challenge for all of us in terms of our own efforts and energies. How much of our efforts and energies do we put into kind of real-time relief work? And how much into campaigning and lobbying. And I struggle all the time in my position to kind of balance that and get it right. But mental health services have been decimated, you know, over you know, decades. It's going to take a while to redress that. And in the meantime, people are in desperate need, and therefore actually any effort that we can make in that regard seems to be the right thing to do, just on a kind of human level.
Thanks, Rick. Does anyone else want to come in on this question? Matt?
Thank you. I think so. Anecdotally, and just looking at our kind of reviews and comments that customers leave us on Trustpilot, so many of them talk around, as I said, not wanting to be here anymore, not being able to sleep at night, feeling a big weight has been lifted on their shoulder once they kind of seek advice. So I think for us, there's a big piece around encouraging people to seek help as early as possible. You know, finances are probably only second to health issues that people are embarrassed to reach out and get support on. But we know, and we've done a recent survey, so the majority of people, 61%, said that they felt more confident about managing their personal finances once they've come to one of our partners. 2/3 said that they trusted their advisor to give accurate advice, and 68% said that they're more informed about the available options. And that will be similar for all of our services for everyone that's on the webinar today. So there's a question around, again, as a sector, how can we encourage more people to seek that advice as early as possible so it doesn't become the emergency situation, people reaching out to food banks or being evicted or whatever it is. And the second point I wanted to make, because we've focused a lot on the kind of mental health on our beneficiaries or customers. Our frontline staff have taken an absolute battering over the last few years, right? And we've, thinking of my team personally, we went 24 hours twice in that, and I expected a relatively young team to answer calls when people had suicidal thoughts, people were, at the end of their tether of what they were able to do. And after that, I needed them to put the phone down, pick it up, and help somebody else. We've asked them to all of a sudden work remotely from home and continue to offer the same level of kind of customer service and advice that we did when they were in the office. And then as we ease through lockdown, it's been this hybrid, come into the office, don't come into the office, we'll come in if you want, but actually no, we need to see some customers and there's a big queue outside, I need you in the office, right? The impact on our team's mental health has been, you can't even measure for my team. And that's not reflected in what our funders provide us to be able to support them through an ever challenging. I spoke earlier around the average number of debts going from 1.9 to 3.9. Our cases are now twice as more complex. Our advisors are trying to help our customers with a load of mental health issues as well as their personal debts. They've never received training in that. We're not funded to do that. So there's a even bigger question, I think, on how do we support our frontline teams to cope in a rapidly ever-changing world around them. And I don't think we've addressed that yet.
Thank you, Matt. I'm conscious we've got quite a few more questions and only about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to skip to a couple more questions. If that's okay, before I come to you for your final remarks. There's a couple of questions in the boxes around this issue of advocacy. So one in terms of obviously within this very devastating picture, as one of our attendees has described, there's obviously some constraints around how we can all speak about political issues, but the question is around how can we speak as one, and I guess that's referring to both funders and frontline organisations. Is there a bit more role for us to combine our voice in terms of campaigns and advocacy, but also a question around the types of messages that we might need to be getting across. So two slightly separate points there, but I think many of you have raised this issue of campaigns and advocacy and balancing that with some of the short-term practical action that's needed. So any kind of observations or comments on that? And Mandir, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so from my perspective, we work more on the research and moving more into advocacy and that sort of side of things, more so than directly frontline services as some of the others here do. But from my perspective, it's about understanding that there's this whole ecosystem of all these different types of players, and like we need to link that up in a way so that organizations like mine understand what's going on in the frontline service, so we can incorporate views and put like lived experience into our advocacy work. And then I think one of the things we're looking at doing is setting up a debt sort of coalition of organizations and using that to more powerfully lobby on certain things, and like strengthening the resistance of this ecosystem to policy making that tends to be in this day and age adverse and not the kind of thing that we would generally probably be calling for. So yeah, like strengthening our resistance to that sort of policy making and those decisions, and yeah, working better together, I would say, and for funders, understanding that these organizations are going to be the ones bearing the brunt of delivering services to people and campaigning on these issues, and where their own funding will then be hit, they sort of need to like ring fence and prioritize funding for these organizations so they don't sort of slip through the net and are unable to function essentially. So there's a lot on funders to be aware of the needs of these groups. So like from the perspective of BME communities, they're likely to, they're the ones that are going to be supporting the communities that they're interested in. And so, yeah, so the funders need to, basically essentially just ring fence and prioritize funding for these people and these groups, and to do it directly and not through intermediaries, so that the effectiveness and timeliness of this money reaching those people at the crucial points of the crisis is like it happens essentially.
Thanks, Mandia. Sophia, if it's, I've just seen you have to be leaving a couple of minutes early to deliver some training, so I just wondered, shall I come to you and see if you had any final kind of comments to share on that point, given your background?
Absolutely. Can you please repeat the question for me?
Yeah, so it was looking at the kind of, can we do more collectively around kind of campaigns and advocacy, or what role could funders play in supporting organisations in this space?
Absolutely. So often funders will have the unique position of a bit of an eagle eye, because you're often funding organisations working along similar themes. So really cultivating that opportunity for coalition and collaborative working, which Mandy has already mentioned. So I would say coalition working together, always a letter that we've done all together with lots of signatures will work better than a bunch of letters individually, bar some circumstances and such. So working together, finding that shared mission, those shared aims, even if it's not the usual work of your organisation. If you find that, for example, perhaps an organisation is working in one area, but you're inundated with other areas because of course you want to help the people that you're there to support holistically, then that creates an opportunity for coalition with working with organisations that are working directly in that area, even if you can't signpost them and you're working directly on it, working collaboratively and using your shared evidence and gathering and collating that and bringing that to the government's eye, sharing your contacts, or working together so that you can leverage your contacts through the right avenues, looking at who has whose ear. So I would say collaboration is the name of the game, particularly at this time when there's so much drowning out that's happening, when we have such a critical mass with this crisis. So yes, that is my overall point in terms of advocacy.
Thanks, Sophia. Given I think the time, I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to still kind of mull on that question, but if, as is kind of traditional in our webinars, we ask all of our panelists to kind of end with a reflection on what action we should take following this discussion. And we've given you the scope to interpret that as you'd like. So whether that action is for us as Londoners, as funders, as civil society groups, as London funders. So any kind of final reflections on the discussion, but if you could kind of come to that point of where can we go from here? I think the scale of the challenge has been illustrated very well by you all. It's obviously hugely challenging to think where we kind of can act, but we've heard some really good ideas and some really inspiring stuff over the last few days, which I hope gives us some optimism to go forward. But let's hear from you in terms of what action you would like to take away. Anybody want to? Sophia, do you need to disappear, or?
I need to disappear, but I'm happy to contribute just before I go.
Okay, you go first.
As a London funder in particular, be that funder that gives funding to the area that people are already working on but can't get funding for. Allow them to be able to work holistically and meet that need in a funded way, rather than burning out their staff and working over hours to do it as an add-on. Also work on the basis of trust. There is so much scope for community-based inclusive advice in community settings, and it's about trusting organisations that are already working on this and putting money behind it so it's sustainable.
Great, thank you very much for joining us. If you have to disappear, thank you. Who would like to go next? Rick.
Shall I go next?
Yeah, great.
I'll keep it brief. I think from the policy and advocacy side, I'm in favour of, I've written down a small number of big asks. I think is the way to go, rather than just bombarding. So I think a small number of big asks made collectively, or as collectively as possible, is the way to go. We've just seen the government make a spectacular U-turn because they say they listened. So that should be good news for campaigners. because it shows that change is possible even with this administration. And in the space of kind of grant making and relief, I think we're now in the business of trying to save lives. I think it's that serious. So we need to take it that seriously. We need to not be precious and get those resources down as low as we can, as close as we can to the ground, so that they can have the biggest impact on the biggest number of people.
Thanks, Rick. Ruth or Matt, Mandy?
So I guess I would have three things to like reflect on, think about what actions to take next. As we kind of talk about that campaigning piece, I think it's worth considering how funders can work to highlight what needs to be changed to fund projects and pilots which will provide evidence to argue for the change we want to see. So a quick example is Trussell Trust Food Banks, in line with Leeds City Council, are working together on a pilot of their local welfare assistance to provide cash first, access to cash first before they come to a food bank. And we are evaluating and demonstrating and pulling together evidence to see how that works, which then enables us to campaign to see more cash first initiatives through local welfare assistance across the UK. So is it worth considering, as you're funding projects, also thinking about how you fund evaluations of those, and then use that for all of us to have a bigger voice together to campaign for change and to not stop talking about the change that needs to happen. And then finally, just thinking about on the ground, as Rick said, getting it as close to possible as those people who need the support. So as already been mentioned, funding advice and financial maximisation services for people who can access them, like Matt's talking about the access beyond 9 to 5. How do we make that advice more accessible for people and increase the capacity, because we know that it's going to be needed.
Thank you, Ruth. Matt, do you want to go next?
Thank you. I think one of the things I'm taking away is kind of picking on Sophia's point earlier around, so our funding for Debt Free London all comes from Money and Pension Service, and that restricts us very specifically from any kind of lobbying activity, even above the kind of Charity Commission's rules. But being able to add our name and support to joint letters, that message of one letter making a louder impact from lots of smaller letters. So that's something I'll take away. And something that I'd like to leave on is just around how debt doesn't discriminate. Right, so I said those stats earlier. So either 50% of people in London are either at immediate risk now of having it, or very in the next kind of few weeks will need debt advice. That means people we work with, our friends, our family, our colleagues, they might not be speaking about it, but many of them are going to be worried about their own financial situation. And just to leave that out, our advice is open to anybody. You can work in the sector, you might not. You could be one of our contractors that works with us, one of our freelancers, one of our frontline staff. Our advice is free and confidential for everybody. I can leave the messages in the chat if people are worried about it immediately. Please do seek that advice as early as possible and encourage others to seek it as early as possible as well, so we can avoid the emergency situations that we spoke about all through today's session.
Thank you, Matt. And Mandia, final word.
So I would just end on saying that many of the groups that have been supporting Black and minority ethnic communities for some time now have been chronically underfunded for most of that time and need to build their resilience. So what this means is they need core costs which keep them running without having to fundraise at hand to mouth. So I'd hammer that message home to funders, just around keep on investing in human rights, social justice and a fairer society, and don't let the commitments made after BLM, where much of the interest was generated, don't let those wane now in the face of increasing pressure.
Thank you so much. We are bang on 11. So I just want to say another thank you to all of our panelists. It's been such a rich discussion. There's been loads of questions which I'm afraid we haven't had time to answer, but we'll try and field those if they're very specific. I know there was one around food banks, so Ruth, I might follow that up with you. But if we haven't got to your question, apologies. Do check out the remaining sessions that we've got in the Cost of Living Week, and do, again, stay in contact with us at London Funders if you've got ideas or other kind of reflections that you want to share as we try and build on all of this practice and try and kind of continue to support our members on how to best kind of support London civil society through this crisis. So once again, thank you for all of your contributions, and yeah, thanks to all of you at home or in the office who've joined us this morning. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.